On the 22nd of December, 1849, a 28-year-old man was taken out of solitary confinement, put in a cart, and driven to a parade ground in the middle of St. Petersburg. There was snow on the square. There were troops drawn up in formation. There was a crowd, because this had been advertised. The prisoners were made to stand and listen while the death sentence was read out to each of them by name. They were told to kiss the cross. A sword was broken over each man's head, which is what the state did to a nobleman before it killed him. Then they were dressed in long white shirts with hoods, because that is what you are buried in. The first three were led forward and tied to posts, and the hoods were pulled down over their eyes. The man we are talking about was in the second group of three, which meant he had watched the whole procedure, understood exactly how long it took, and could now calculate with some precision that he had less than a minute left to be alive. His name was Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, and what happens next is the reason this video exists. Because the rifles did not fire. A retreat was sounded. An officer rode out with a piece of paper, and the paper said that His Imperial Majesty, in his mercy, had commuted the sentence. The whole thing had been staged. The Tsar had signed the reprieve days earlier and given instructions that it was not to be delivered until the men were standing at the posts. It was theatre. It was designed to be survived and to be remembered. One of the men in that group, a man named Grigoriev, never recovered his mind. Dostoevsky went back to his cell, and that same day wrote a letter to his brother Mikhail. He is not calm in it. He is not wise in it. He is 28, and he has just been handed his own life back, still warm, and he writes this: "Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Each minute might have been an age of it." Hold on to that sentence, because everything that follows is going to argue with it. Because here is what that man then did with the gift. He went to Siberia for 4 years in leg irons. He came back and spent the next 3 decades writing book after book about people who were handed exactly that same gift and who set it on fire on purpose, while sober, while knowing better. He wrote about a man who is offered comfort, dignity, and a decent life, and who chooses instead to sit alone in a rented room for 20 years, perfecting his own humiliation because it is his. He wrote about a student who has a future, a sister who loves him, and a friend who would do anything for him, and who instead works out a philosophical justification for murder and then carries it out with a borrowed axe. He wrote about a woman who is offered forgiveness and runs from it twice, because being forgiven would mean being seen. He wrote about a father and 3 sons who each have in front of them a life that could still be repaired, and who take it apart with their hands. And in his own life he did it too. He was a compulsive gambler, not a casual one. The kind who pawns his wife's wedding ring, wins it back, loses it again the same night, and writes a letter of such abject self-disgust that you can barely read it, and then goes back to the tables the following week. So this is the question the whole of Dostoevsky is built on, and it is not a literary question, it is a question about you. Why would a creature that wants to be happy, that says it wants to be happy, that can describe in detail the life that would make it happy, reliably and repeatedly choose the thing that wrecks it? The easy answers were all available to him, and he rejected every one. It is not ignorance. His characters are the most self-aware people in fiction. The underground man understands his own pathology better than his therapist would. It is not weakness of will, not in the way we mean it. These are people capable of extraordinary sustained effort. They just aim it downward. It is not trauma alone, though he knew more about trauma than almost anyone writing at the time, having been through the kind that gets a wing of a hospital named after it. His answer is stranger than any of those, and much harder to get out of, and it is the reason the man Nietzsche later called the only psychologist he had anything to learn from was a novelist and not a doctor. His answer is that you do not actually want to be happy. You want to be free, and you will take any amount of suffering as proof that you are. Those two things look like they should be compatible. Almost everything in your life is arranged on the assumption that they are compatible. Dostoevsky's entire body of work is the discovery that, for a certain kind of person, under certain kinds of pressure, they are not, and that the person will choose freedom over happiness every single time, and will not be able to explain why afterwards. Over the next 2.5 hours, we are going to follow that discovery all the way down and all the way back up. We are going to go into the underground and find the argument he made there that was so dangerous his own government censored the answer out of it, and that he never restored, so that for 160 years every reader has been reading half a case. We are going to look at the 4 years in Siberia that killed one set of his beliefs and, on a prison bunk on an Easter afternoon, replaced it with something he had not chosen. We are going to look at the illness that gave him seconds he said he would trade 10 years of life for, and the price it charged him, which was worse than anything in the novels. We are going to build, carefully and without cheating, the strongest argument against God ever put on paper, which he wrote himself on purpose and was proud of. And then we are going to look at the answer he gave to it, which is not the answer you are expecting, which is not comforting, and which he described in his own words as harsh and fearful. No mysticism, no life advice, no moral at the end you could have got from a poster. Just the most accurate map anyone has ever drawn of the part of a person that works against itself. Some lessons do not help you sleep. Part 1. The Underground. In 1863, a Russian writer named Nikolai Chernyshevsky published a novel called What Is to Be Done, and it became the most influential book in the country almost overnight. It is, as a novel, not very good. Chernyshevsky wrote it in prison, and it shows. But it was not read as a novel, it was read as a blueprint, and for 2 generations of young Russians it functioned as one. Lenin later took its title for his own pamphlet, which tells you what kind of book it was. The argument of it is simple, and, on its face, extremely reasonable. Human beings act in their own interest. They mostly act badly because they are mistaken about where their interest lies. Educate them properly, arrange society rationally, remove the conditions that produce cruelty, and you will get people who behave well, because behaving well will visibly be the best available option. Self-interest, correctly calculated, becomes indistinguishable from virtue. And in the middle of the book there is a dream. One of the characters falls asleep and sees the future, and the future is a building. An enormous structure of iron and glass, with gardens inside it, where everyone lives together and works cheerfully, and no one is poor and no one is cruel. Chernyshevsky did not invent that image. He had seen it. Or rather, Dostoevsky had, and had reported it. In 1862, Dostoevsky travelled through Europe for the first time and went to London, where the Crystal Palace had been re-erected at Sydenham, enormous, modern, full of light, glass and iron on a scale nobody had built at before. He walked through it, and he walked through the London slums in the same week, and what he wrote afterwards is not what you would expect from a man who is supposed to be a reactionary. He is not offended by it, he is frightened by it. He describes standing inside this vast, beautiful thing and feeling that it is finished, that here is the final form, that it is so complete, so evidently correct, so obviously the right way to arrange human life, that to stand inside it is to feel a kind of pressure to submit. Something in him, standing under all that glass, wanted to say no, and he could not immediately say why, and that failure to say why bothered him for 2 years. Then, at the end of 1863, he sat down to write a review of Chernyshevsky's novel. What came out instead was 100 pages in the voice of a man in a rented room in Petersburg who has not spoken to another human being in a very long time. Notes from Underground opens with 3 sentences that are still, 160 years later, the most efficient character introduction in literature. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. And then he tells you that he thinks there is something wrong with his liver, and that he has never gone to a doctor about it, and that he is not going to, and that he knows this only harms himself, and that this is exactly the point. That is the whole book in one gesture in the first paragraph, before the argument has even started. Because here is what the underground man is doing. He is not disagreeing with Chernyshevsky about the facts. He accepts every fact. He accepts that a rationally arranged society would produce more happiness. He accepts that his own behavior is self-destructive. He accepts that he is, by every measure the Crystal Palace would recognize, wrong. What he denies is that this settles it. And his argument is one of the strangest and most durable things anyone has ever written about human motivation. It goes like this. You have built your entire model of me out of my advantages. Food, safety, comfort, status, love, prosperity. And you have catalogued them, and you say that once I have them, I will be satisfied, and if I am not satisfied, I must be confused about what they are. But you have left one out. There is an advantage that is not on your list, and it is the most advantageous advantage of all, and it is this: the right to want what harms me. Not the right to be mistaken. He is very specific about this. not a bug in the system that better education fixes. The deliberate, clear-eyed preference for the worst thing, chosen precisely because it is worse, because choosing it is the only way to prove that the choosing was real. And then he gives the example that made this book famous. Twice two makes four, he says, is an excellent thing. But twice two makes five is sometimes a most charming little thing too. Understand what is actually being claimed there, because it gets quoted as if it were whimsy, and it is not whimsy. He is saying that when the world is so completely determined, so fully explained, so utterly reasonable that your future can be calculated in advance like a sum, then the only remaining proof that you are a person and not a piano key is your ability to introduce an error. To answer 4, when the answer is 4, forever, is to be a mechanism. To answer 5, once, knowing it is wrong, and to pay for it, is to be somebody. He says it in the plainest possible language, and this is the sentence the whole book turns on. A man may wish upon himself something harmful, stupid, even outright idiotic, simply in order to have the right to wish for himself even what is very stupid, and not be bound by an obligation to wish only what is sensible. This is not an argument for stupidity. It is a diagnosis of what freedom costs, when freedom is the only thing you have left. And it explains with terrible accuracy a category of human behavior that nothing else explains. The person who sabotages the relationship that was working, the one who misses the deadline for the job they actually wanted, the one who cannot accept help without insulting the helper, the one who is doing well and finds it unbearable. Not because they want to fail, because success, in this case, was arriving on someone else's terms, and there is a part of a person that would rather own its ruin than rent its flourishing. Now here is the part almost nobody knows, and it changes how you read the entire book. Notes from Underground did not come out the way he wrote it. The censor cut it, and on the 26th of March, 1864, Dostoevsky wrote to his brother Mikhail about what had been done to it, and he is incandescent. He says the censors are swine. He says they let stand every passage where he jeered at everything and blasphemed everything, and then he says this: where I mocked at everything and sometimes blasphemed for form's sake, that is let pass. But where from all this I deduced the need of faith in Christ, that is suppressed. The chapter that took the damage was chapter 10 of the first part, which Dostoevsky described as the most important one, the one where the essential thought is expressed: so the demolition survived, in full, and the conclusion was cut out of it. And he never put it back. He republished the book. He had the opportunity more than once over 17 years. And he never restored the passage. And he never wrote down what it had said. And no manuscript of it survives. It is simply gone. Sit with the size of that for a second. The founding document of modern psychological fiction, the book that Nietzsche read, that Kafka read, that Sartre and Camus and Ellison read, the book that basically invents the unreliable narrator as we now use him, is a mutilated argument. Every reader in history has received the prosecution and never the defense. We have all been reading a man tear the world apart, and the page where he says what he would build instead has been torn out of every copy that has ever existed, which means something uncomfortable. It means the underground man as we know him, the patron saint of every alienated reader who ever felt seen by that book, may be a censorship artifact. The character who has convinced 160 years of readers that there is no way out of the room might have been written by a man who thought he had found the door and who was not allowed to describe it. We will never know. That is not a mystery that gets solved later in this video. It is just a hole, and it is worth knowing the hole is there. Now, one more thing about this book, because it is the bridge to the rest of everything. In February 1887, in a bookshop in Nice, a sick, half-blind German with permanent migraines picked up a French translation with the title The Spirit Underground and read it. He wrote to his friend Franz Overbeck about it on the 23rd of February. He said the discovery was pure chance. He said his heart rejoiced. 2 years later, in Twilight of the Idols, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. The only one. From the man who was busy inventing the psychology of resentment, of the bad conscience, of the will that turns back on itself and calls the wound a virtue. They never met. They never corresponded. Dostoevsky had been dead for 6 years when Nietzsche opened that book. He never knew Nietzsche existed. But every idea Nietzsche is famous for having about the interior of a suffering person, Dostoevsky had already put in the mouth of a man in a rented room in Petersburg who cannot stop talking and who is not sure whether he is confessing or boasting, and who ends the book by saying that he has only carried to an extreme what the rest of us have not dared carry halfway. Part 2. The pleasure in the wound. There is a Russian word that does not survive translation, and the fact that it does not survive translation is one of the reasons English-speaking readers systematically misread Dostoevsky. The word is nadryv. It comes from a verb that means to tear, to rip, to strain something past the point where it holds. In a medical context, it is what happens to a muscle. In Dostoevsky, it is what happens to a person. English translators have tried laceration. They have tried self-laceration. They have tried strain and rupture and crack-up. The Pevier and Volokhonsky translation of the brothers Karamazov gives up and just titles the whole of Book 4 with it. Here is what it actually means. Nadryv is a wound you keep open on purpose, because the pain of it has become the proof of something you need proved. It is not masochism exactly. Masochism wants the pain. Nadryv wants what the pain establishes. It is the state of a person who has found that suffering is the only reliable evidence of their own depth, and who therefore cannot afford to stop suffering because the alternative is a self they consider unbearably small. And once you have the word, you start seeing it in places the English text does not flag. Katerina Ivanovna in The Brothers Karamazov is the clearest case. Dmitri once humiliated her in a scene of such precise cruelty that it is hard to read, and her response is to devote her life to him, to sacrifice for him, to forgive him publicly and at length and in front of witnesses. And Dostoevsky is absolutely explicit that this is not love. It is the wound being kept open, because as long as she is the woman nobly suffering over Dmitri, she is somebody magnificent. If she simply let it go, she would be an ordinary woman who once had a bad night. She would rather be tragic than fine. And Dostoevsky's judgment on this is not contempt. That is what makes him different from every satirist who has ever written the same character. He thinks this is one of the most human things there is. He thinks it is what people do with pain when they have no other use for it. He also thought it was extremely dangerous, and he knew that from the inside because he had a version of it that nearly destroyed his life. He was a gambler, roulette mostly. And not in the way that phrase usually gets used in a biography, as a colourful detail. It was the central financial and moral catastrophe of his middle years. The pattern is documented in appalling detail because his second wife kept a diary and because he wrote letters after every collapse. And the pattern is always the same, and it is worth walking through because it is not the pattern you would expect. He would arrive in a German spa town. He would win, often substantially. He would write a letter full of confidence about the system he was using, which was really just a resolution to stop at a fixed point. Then he would fail to stop. Then he would lose everything, including the money that was not his to lose. Then he would pawn things, his overcoat, his wife's dresses, on more than one occasion her wedding ring. Anna, his wife, records this without much drama, which somehow makes it worse. And then he would write a letter, and the letters are the interesting part, because they are not the letters of a man making excuses. They are the letters of a man who has understood himself with total clarity and is going to do it again anyway. He describes himself as vile. He describes the exact mechanism. He tells her he is not worth her. He begs. And then, at the end, he asks for more money, and there is always a reason why this time is structurally different. And Anna sent it, every time. She had worked out something about him that the moralists around him had not, which is that shame was the fuel, not the brake. That every letter of self-disgust was part of the loop rather than an interruption of it. She stopped treating it as a moral failing and started treating it as weather. And eventually, in 1871, it stopped. He walked out of a casino in Wiesbaden, having lost everything again, and something in him closed the account, and he never gambled again for the last 10 years of his life. But before that happened, the addiction produced the single most consequential deadline of his career, and the story is so improbable that if he had put it in a novel, his editor would have cut it. By 1866 he was drowning. Debts from his dead brother's magazine, debts from the tables, creditors circling. And a publisher named Fyodor Dostoevsky offered him a way out on terms that tell you exactly what kind of man Dostoevsky was. Dostoevsky would pay him 3,000 rubles now. In exchange, Dostoevsky would deliver a brand new novel by the 1st of November, 1866. And if he failed to deliver, Dostoevsky would acquire the rights to everything Dostoevsky wrote for the next 9 years, without paying him anything for it. Not the rights to that book, the rights to all of it. Everything he would ever produce in his 40s which is to say the entire back half of one of the greatest bodies of work in world literature, forfeited, royalty-free, for missing a date. He took the money, he paid the creditors, and then he did what he always did, which was work on the other book, the one he actually cared about, which was Crime and Punishment. By the beginning of October, he had 26 days and not a word written. A friend suggested a stenographer. He resisted because he had always composed by writing and rewriting by hand. Then he gave in, and the agency sent a 20-year-old woman named Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, who was one of the first professionally trained stenographers in Russia and who had, as it happens, read his books. They worked every day. He paced and dictated. She took it down in shorthand, went home, transcribed it overnight, and came back the next morning with clean pages. They finished The Gambler, a novel about a man destroyed by roulette, dictated by a man being destroyed by roulette to pay a debt caused by roulette in 26 days. And then Dostoevsky, who had never wanted the novel and had always wanted the 9 years, closed his office and left Petersburg so that delivery would be impossible. It was Anna who worked out the counter. She told him to take the manuscript to the police official of the district where Dostoevsky lived and file it there with a receipt. He handed it over 2 hours before the deadline. He married her in February 1867. She was 21. He was 45. She managed his contracts, learned publishing, cut out the middlemen, eventually published his books herself, got him out of debt, and is very probably the reason the brothers Karamazov exists. So the ledger on the worst thing about him reads like this. The compulsion that pawned her wedding ring also created the deadline that put her in the room. He did not earn that. It is not a moral. It is just what happened. And Dostoevsky, who never wrote a clean redemption in his life, would have refused to tidy it. Now hold that pattern in your head, because we are about to watch him build a whole philosophy on it. The underground man wants the freedom to want what harms him. Katerina wants the wound because the wound makes her large. The gambler wants the loss because the loss is the only thing that feels like an event. Underneath all three is the same engine, and Dostoevsky names it more than once, in different characters, in almost the same words. It is better to be a monster than to be nothing. It is better to be despised than to be unnoticed. It is better to suffer enormously than to be, in your own estimation, a small person having a manageable life. That is not a Russian eccentricity. That is a mechanism, and it is running in people who have never read a page of him, and it explains more of what you have watched people do and more of what you have done yourself than almost any theory that has been proposed since. Part 3. The Double. To understand what happened to him next, you have to understand how the career started. Because it started at a height almost nobody starts at, and then it fell off a cliff within 12 months. In 1845, he was 23, a military engineer who had resigned his commission, broke, living in rented rooms, and he finished a short first novel called Poor Folk. It is a book of letters between an aging clerk and a young woman, and it is about poverty and about the specific humiliation of being poor in a city that can see you. A friend took the manuscript to the poet Nekrasov. Nekrasov started reading it at night, intending to skim a few pages, and did not stop. At 4 a.m, he and the friend went to Dostoevsky's apartment, woke him up, and embraced him. Then Nekrasov took it to Vissarion Belinsky, who was the most powerful critic in Russia and whose opinion could make or unmake a writer in a season. "A new Gogol has appeared," Nekrasov announced. "With you," Belinsky replied. "Goggles spring up like mushrooms." And then he read it and summoned the 24-year-old author and told him to his face that he did not understand what he had done, that he had, as an artist, reached the truth by instinct without knowing it was there. Dostoevsky wrote later that this was the most rapturous moment of his entire life. He walked out into the street convinced that a new existence had begun. It lasted about a year, because the next thing he published, in 1846, was a novella called The Double, and the reception was a massacre. Reviewers said it was derivative. They said he was copying Gogol or copying Hoffman, and some of them said the word plagiarism out loud. Even Belinsky, who had discovered him and championed him and been publicly vouching for him, ended up making excuses for how his protégé had misused the talent. Petersburg Literary Society, which had spent a year treating him as a prodigy, dropped him with the particular speed of a scene that is embarrassed about having been enthusiastic. And here is why that matters, and why The Double is not a footnote. The book they threw out was about 70 years early. The Double is the story of a minor government clerk named Yakov Petrovich Golyadkin, a nervous, self-effacing, deeply insecure man who is desperate to be treated as a person of consequence and who is not. He goes to a party he has not been invited to and is humiliated. He walks home through a snowstorm, and on the way home he meets himself. Another Golyadkin. Same face, same name, same rank, same coat. And this second Golyadkin is everything the first one has never managed to be. Confident, charming, quick. He knows how to talk to superiors. He gets the laugh. Within days, he has taken the first Golyadkin's work, his standing, his few relationships, and his place in the office, and he does it while being perfectly pleasant about it. Nobody else in the book finds any of this strange. That is the detail that makes it modern. There is no scene where the other characters gasp. Nobody says, "Sir, there appear to be two of you." The world simply absorbs the second Golyadkin, which leaves the reader in a position that fiction in 1846 had not really put anyone in before, unable to determine whether you are reading a fantasy story or watching a mind come apart from the inside, in real time, in its own voice. Because the whole thing is narrated so close to Golyadkin's perception that his deterioration is not described, it is transmitted. The sentences get more frantic. He starts having conversations with himself in the third person. He rehearses what he will say and then cannot say it. He becomes convinced there is a conspiracy, and there is not. The book ends with him being taken away in a carriage. Now, in 1846, the vocabulary for what he was writing about did not exist. Dissociation had not been named in the way we use it. The clinical literature on what would eventually be called depersonalization was decades off. Split off parts of the self. The idea that a person under intolerable pressure might externalize the disowned portion of himself and then be persecuted by it is a 20th century framework, and Dostoevsky is doing it in narrative form before Freud is born. He is also doing something more specific, which is what makes it his and not just an early ghost story. The second Golyadkin is not a monster. He is not the man's evil side. He is the successful version, the one who can do the things the first one cannot. Everything Golyadkin has repressed in himself in order to remain modest, deferential, safe, and small, comes back wearing his own face and takes his life away from him, and it does not even have to fight him for it. It just performs better. That is a description of a psychological mechanism so exact that Jung would build a career on it 70 years later and give it a name, and the name would be the shadow, and the crucial insight would be the same one Dostoevsky had in 1846, that the part you disown does not go away. It gets stronger in the dark, and it comes back at the worst possible moment wearing your face. The reviewers thought it was a bad imitation of Gogol. He never entirely let it go. He revised it decades later, in 1866, cutting it down and tightening it, which is not what a writer does with a book he has written off. And the machinery of it, the man who cannot bear his own smallness and generate something that both is and is not himself to carry the weight, goes on running underneath everything he wrote afterwards. Ivan Karamazov, at the crisis of the greatest novel Dostoevsky ever wrote, sits in a room and has a long, humiliating, extremely funny conversation with a shabby, sponging devil, who may be a hallucination and who knows every single one of Ivan's own arguments, because he is made of them. Same device, 34 years later, except by then Dostoevsky knew exactly what he was doing with it, and the literary world had caught up enough to call it genius instead of plagiarism. So the pattern of his 20s looks like this: sudden acclaim, immediate collapse, public humiliation among people whose approval he had wanted badly, and the specific experience of having produced the truest thing he was capable of and being told it was worthless. That is where he was, professionally and personally, when he started attending the Friday evening meetings of a discussion circle at the house of a man named Mikhail Petrushevsky, where they read banned French socialist literature out loud, and where, in the spring of 1849, the political police had already placed an informer. Part 4. The Peasant Marey. The Petrushevsky Circle was not a terrorist cell. It is important to be accurate about this because the punishment only makes sense if you understand how little was required to earn it. It was a group of educated young men who met on Friday evenings to eat, drink, tea, and read and argue about banned books. Fourier. Utopian socialism, the abolition of serfdom, which was still 12 years away and which every civilized person in the room considered obviously indefensible. The specific act that produced Dostoevsky's death sentence was reading a letter out loud. The letter was Belinsky's letter to Gogol, written in 1847, a furious attack on Gogol for having published a book defending serfdom, autocracy, and the Orthodox Church. Belinsky was dying of tuberculosis when he wrote it, and it reads like it. It's circulated in manuscript because it could not be printed. Dostoevsky read it aloud to the circle. For that, and for association, 21 men were sentenced to be shot. We have already seen the square. What we have not looked at is what came after, because the reprieve was not mercy, it was a substitution. He was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, to be followed by compulsory service as a private soldier. He was put in leg irons and sent to a stockade at Omsk, and he wore those irons for 4 years, day and night, including while he slept. He worked. He was flogged, at least once, badly enough to be hospitalized. He lived in a wooden barracks with the worst criminals in the Russian Empire, murderers mostly, in a room where the floor was rotten and filthy, where nobody had privacy for a single minute of 4 years, and where he was hated on sight. He was hated because he was a nobleman. That is the detail that reorganizes everything. The convicts did not care that he was a political prisoner suffering for a cause that was, in theory, theirs. They saw the class he came from, and the class he came from had been flogging them and their fathers for centuries, and they treated him accordingly. They stole from him. They would not eat with him. One of them told him, quite openly, that noblemen have iron beaks and peck at people. Now consider the position that puts him in. He is a 28-year-old idealist who went to prison for believing in the liberation of the Russian people, and he is now locked in a room with the Russian people who despise him and who are not the abstraction he had been defending. They are violent, they are unpredictable, some of them are genuinely monstrous. He watches men beaten. He watches men die. He records, in the book he later made out of this, a convict who murdered a child and describes the crime cheerfully. Everything he had believed at Petrashevsky's about human nature is now being tested under laboratory conditions, and it is failing. He wrote about it afterwards in a book called Notes from the House of the Dead, which is one of the founding texts of prison literature and which Tolstoy considered the best thing he ever wrote. But the moment that actually did the work, he did not put in that book. He held it for 25 years and then published it as 4 pages in his magazine in 1876, and it is called The Peasant Marey. Here is what happens in it. It is Easter week, somewhere around 1850. The prisoners have been given a holiday, which means they have been given drink, which means the barracks has turned into something out of a nightmare. Men fighting, men screaming, somebody being beaten senseless. Dostoevsky writes that he had never seen anything so hideous. He goes and lies down on his bunk with his eyes shut so that he does not have to watch. And a Polish political prisoner, a man he knew named Mireki, walks past his bunk and stops and looks at the room and says one sentence to him in French, because they both spoke French and the convicts did not. Je hais ces brigands. I hate these brigands." And Marey walks away, and Dostoevsky lies there, and he says that at that moment he could have agreed with him. Everything in the room supported it. 4 years of evidence supported it. The reasonable, educated, humane conclusion was that these people were animals. And instead, with no effort of will, unbidden, out of nowhere, he remembers something from when he was 9 years old. He is at his family's small estate in the country. It is August. He has wandered off alone to the edge of a wood, and he is poking at a beetle. And he suddenly hears a voice shout, quite clearly, "Wolf!" There was no wolf. He understood later that there was no wolf, but he is 9, and he screams, and he runs out into the open field. And in the field, there is a serf ploughing, one of his father's serfs, a man in his 50s named Marey. And Marey stops. And this is the whole thing. This is the entire point of the 4 pages, and it is all in the details. So listen to what the man actually does. He puts his hand out and touches the boy's cheek. He tells him there is no wolf, that he imagined it. He makes the sign of the cross over him, and then he crosses himself. He is smiling at the boy with what Dostoevsky calls an almost maternal tenderness. And then, because the child is still frightened, he says he will watch him go, and stands there in the field and does not go back to the plough until the boy has reached the house, turning to check that Marey is still watching, and he is. That is it. That is the whole memory. Nothing else happens. And Dostoevsky, lying on a prison bunk 22 years later in a room full of drunk murderers, recovers it, and he says that when he got up off that bunk and looked around at those men, he was looking at something different, not better. He is very careful about this, and readers get it wrong constantly. He does not decide the convicts are secretly good. He does not become sentimental about the people. He is not proposing that suffering ennobles anybody, an idea he actively despised. What he says is this: any one of these men could be Marey. That is all. That the same man who is shaven-headed and branded and drunk and dangerous in this room is also, and at the same time, the man who might stop his plough in a field for a frightened child, and that nothing in either fact cancels the other. That the capacity is in there, unevenly distributed, unreliable, invisible from outside, and not deducible from behavior. And notice what kind of event this was. He was not argued into it. Nobody presented him with a superior theory. He did not read his way out. He was lying down with his eyes closed, and a memory arrived, uninvited, and rearranged him. The evidence that overturned 4 years of experience was a 30-second interaction with a serf that he had not thought about once since it happened, and which had been sitting in him the entire time, doing nothing, until the exact moment it was needed. That is a psychological claim, and it is a strange one, and he built the rest of his life on it. It is the reason his novels do not work the way other novels work. There is no argument in Dostoevsky that defeats another argument. Ivan is never refuted. Raskolnikov is never out-reasoned. The characters who change are changed by something that arrives sideways, usually through another person, usually without words, and usually at a moment when they had already reached the sensible conclusion. He came out of Siberia in 1854. He had lost the politics. He had also lost permanently the thing that had made the politics possible, which was the belief that if you get the system right, the people inside it will come out right. And he had gained a conviction that would put him at odds with almost every serious thinker of his century, which is that no arrangement of society, however rational, can reach the place where the actual problem is. He had one more thing too, and he had picked it up in the barracks at Omsk, and it never left him. He had started having seizures. Part 5. The Aura. The exact date his epilepsy began is disputed. Some accounts place attacks earlier, in his 20s. The seizures become unmistakable and continuous from the prison years onward, and he lived with them for the rest of his life. What is not disputed is what he said they were like, because he said it repeatedly, to friends, to his wife, and eventually in print. For some people with certain kinds of epilepsy, a seizure is preceded by an aura, a warning state. Usually it is unpleasant, a smell that is not there, a sinking in the stomach, a sense of dread. His was not unpleasant. He told the philosopher Nikolai Strakov that for a few seconds before an attack he experienced a happiness that is unthinkable in a normal state and that a person who has not felt it cannot imagine. He said he was in complete harmony with himself and with the whole world. And then he put it in a novel and gave it to a character who has his illness, and let the character say the thing he clearly could not quite say in his own voice. The character is Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, and this is what he says. For a few brief moments I feel a kind of happiness that is unthinkable in a normal state and which is unimaginable for other people. I feel complete harmony with myself and with the whole world, and this sensation is so powerful and sweet that one would give 10 years of life, perhaps one's whole life, for a few seconds of such bliss. 10 years of life for a few seconds. Now, the obvious response to this is the medical one. It is a disease. It is abnormal electrical activity in the temporal lobe. The feeling of cosmic significance is a symptom, no more meaningful than the taste of pennies before a migraine. The brain is malfunctioning and producing certainty as a byproduct. Dostoevsky knew that. He was not a man in the dark about his own condition. He had doctors. He kept records of his attacks in his notebooks. And he made Mishkin say the medical objection out loud and then answer it. And the answer is one of the most interesting things in 19th century writing about the mind. What matter though it be only disease, Mishkin says. An abnormal tension of the brain, if, when I recall and analyze the moment, it seems to have been one of harmony and beauty in the highest degree, an instant of deepest sensation, overflowing with unbounded joy and rapture, ecstatic devotion, and completest life. Read the structure of that argument, because it is doing something careful. He is not denying the diagnosis. He concedes the diagnosis entirely. What he refuses is the assumption that giving something a cause has told you what it is worth. The seizure explains where the state came from. It does not, by itself, establish that the state was empty. And that refusal is the same refusal running under everything else he wrote. The underground man will not accept that. Explaining his behavior disposes of it. Raskolnikov will not accept that a correct theory settles a moral question. And here Dostoevsky will not accept that a neurological account of an experience is automatically a verdict on the experience. You can disagree with him. Plenty of people should. But notice that it is an argument, and that it is a better one than it is usually given credit for. Because the alternative principle, that a state of mind is worthless if it has a physical cause, applies to every state of mind you have ever had, including your confidence in that principle. He paid for those seconds, and the price is not the part that gets quoted. The seizures got worse with age. He describes the aftermath in his letters, and it is not romantic. He would lose days. He describes waking with his whole body wrecked, unable to think clearly, and worse than that, a specific and terrible feature of the recovery period, a black, groundless guilt. A conviction that he had committed some enormous crime, with no crime available to attach it to. He called it feeling like a criminal. It would last for days and then lift, having pointed at nothing. Think about what it does to a writer to have his own brain manufacture, on a schedule, the exact sensation of unbearable guilt with no object, and then think about what he wrote. He wrote the greatest novel ever written about a man being destroyed by guilt over a crime he did commit, and he wrote a novel about a man destroyed by guilt over a murder he did not commit but wished for. And he wrote a character who says that everyone is guilty for everything in front of everyone. That does not make the ideas symptoms. It does mean he had unusually direct access to the raw material. Now, the most famous psychologist of the 20th century read all of this and got it wrong in public. In 1928, Sigmund Freud published an essay called Dostoevsky and Parricide as an introduction to a German scholarly volume on the brothers Karamazov. And in it, Freud states that Dostoevsky did not have epilepsy at all. His position was that the attacks were hysteroepilepsy, which is to say severe hysteria, a neurotic symptom, not a neurological disease. And the cause, Freud said, was guilt. Specifically, guilt about wishing his father dead, an unconscious wish that was then apparently confirmed when the father actually died, leaving Dostoevsky to punish himself with fits for the rest of his life. The essay is elegant. It is also, on the medical question, wrong, and it has been under sustained attack since the 1930s, and the diagnosis is not accepted today. But the interesting failure is not the diagnosis, it is the method. Freud built the case substantially by reading the novels as evidence about the novelist. Fyodor Karamazov is murdered, and Dostoevsky's own father died in circumstances that were rumored, on thin evidence, to be murder by his own serfs, and so the novel is treated as a confession in disguise. Which is precisely the move Dostoevsky spent his whole career making impossible. Because the thing about his books, the structural thing, is that you cannot extract the author's position from them. Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian critic who described this better than anyone, called Dostoevsky's novels polyphonic, a plurality of independent and unmerged voices and consciousnesses. His point is that the characters are not instruments the author plays. They are not delivering his opinion in costume. The author never takes the final word away from them, which is why nobody can agree about what Dostoevsky thought and why the books keep working on the fourth reading. So when Freud reads the murder of a father in a polyphonic novel as testimony about the man holding the pen, he is making a category error the novel itself is built to defeat. The greatest psychologist of one century, misreading the novelist another philosopher had called the only psychologist worth learning from by treating fiction as a case file. And now the part of this that has no argument in it at all. He passed it on. His son Alexei, whom the family called Alyosha, was born in 1875. In 1878, at the age of 3, the boy had a seizure and died of it. He had inherited his father's illness. Dostoevsky was 56. There is not much on record about the immediate aftermath, because what is on record is Anna's, and Anna wrote that she was frightened by how he took it, and that she persuaded him to go away. He went to Optina Pustin, a monastery, with a young philosopher named Vladimir Solovyov. He spent several days there. He talked at length with the elders, and above all with one of them, the elder Ambrose, who was the most famous spiritual director in Russia and who received hundreds of ordinary people, peasants mostly, who came to him with grief. And he watched a man whose entire vocation was sitting with people at the worst moment of their lives. He came home and began the last thing he would write. The Brothers Karamazov has an elder in it, and the elder's name is Zosima. And Zosima receives grieving people, and there is a scene early on where a peasant woman comes to him having lost her 3-year-old son and cannot stop crying, and says she cannot bear it. And the elder does not tell her that the child is in a better place, and does not tell her to be strong, and tells her instead not to be comforted and to weep, and that this kind of weeping will turn in the end into a quiet joy, and that she should go on weeping until then. And the hero of that novel, the youngest brother, the one who is at the moral center of it, the one Dostoevsky said in the preface was the one he actually cared about, is called Alyosha. He gave his dead son's name to the only fully good character he ever created, and then spent 2 years, the last 2 of his life, writing him a world to be good in. Part 6. The theory that kills. Everybody knows the plot of Crime and Punishment. A poor student in Petersburg murders an old pawnbroker with an axe and is eventually caught and confesses and goes to Siberia. Almost everybody misremembers what the book is about. It is not a book about whether he will get away with it. The suspense is not that kind. He is effectively identified by the reader in the first 50 pages and by the investigator not long after, and the investigator has no evidence and both of them know it. It is a book about what a theory does to the person holding it. Raskolnikov, before the murder, writes an article. This matters more than the acts. The article is called On Crime, and it was published in a journal months earlier, and he had half forgotten it, and its argument is this. Humanity divides into two categories. The ordinary, who exist to reproduce the species and must live obediently under the law, and the extraordinary, who have the right, an inner right, to step over the law if stepping over it is required to deliver an idea the world needs. He gives examples: Lycurgus, Solon, Muhammad, Napoleon above all. He points out, correctly, that every founder and lawgiver in history was a criminal by the standards of the law they replaced, because they replaced it by breaking it. That the men who moved the world moved it over bodies, and that we now name streets after them. And then he makes the move that dooms him. He asks whether he is one, because that is the flaw sitting in the middle of the theory, and Dostoevsky puts it there deliberately. The theory offers no test. There is no way to establish in advance which category you are in. The only way to find out whether you are a Napoleon is to do a Napoleonic thing and see whether you can carry it. So the murder is not primarily greed, though he is starving. It is not primarily ideology, though the ideology is real. It is an experiment, and the subject of the experiment is himself. He said it out loud later to Sonia, and the line is the key to the whole novel. I wanted to become a Napoleon. That is why I killed her. And then, a few pages on, the correction, which is the thing the book was written to say. Did I kill the old woman? I killed myself, not her. Now watch how Dostoevsky breaks the theory. He does not break it with an argument. Nobody in the novel out-reasons Raskolnikov, and this is deliberate because Dostoevsky did not believe a bad idea is defeated by a better idea. He breaks it with facts on the ground. The first fact is Lizaveta. Raskolnikov plans one murder. He gets two because the pawnbroker's half-sister Lizaveta, who is simple, harmless, pregnant in some readings, and universally described as gentle, comes home early and walks in on him, and he kills her too, out of panic, with the blunt side of the axe, and she does not even raise her arms to protect herself. She lifts one hand slightly, like a child, and the theory has no space for her. The theory was about a useless, vicious old money lender whose death releases capital that a brilliant young man could use for the good of many. It is a utilitarian sum, and the sum works. Lizaveta is not in the sum. She is what the sum does not know about, and every theory of this shape has a Lizaveta in it, and she is always discovered afterwards. That is the actual argument of the book against the actual philosophy, and it is not moral outrage, it is an engineering observation. The extraordinary man theory fails not because it is wicked, but because it assumes a level of prediction no human being possesses. The second fact is his body, because the theory said he would step over and feel nothing, and instead he collapses. Immediately, he has a fever for days. He hides the stolen goods under a rock and never uses them. never even counts them, which is the detail that tells you the money was never the point. He becomes unable to be around people. He nearly confesses to a stranger, then to a police clerk, then in the street. He is drawn back to the apartment and rings the bell to hear the sound of it again. And Dostoevsky is not saying that guilt is a moral fact enforcing itself. He is saying something more interesting and more clinical. He is saying that a human being is not built to be the sole author of the rules he lives under, and that the attempt produces a specific and recognizable pathology, and the pathology looks exactly like isolation. The Russian is right there in the name. Raskolnikov comes from Raskol, meaning split, or schism, the word used for the great split in the Russian church. He is the split man, not evil, split. And this is where the novel does something genuinely radical. It gives you the control group. His name is Svidrigailov, and he is what Raskolnikov thinks he wants to be. Svidrigailov has actually done it. He has stepped over repeatedly in ways the book only ever half describes, and there are at least 2 deaths behind him, and something much worse involving a child, and he has no fever, no delirium, no compulsion to confess. He is charming. He is relaxed. He sleeps. He has achieved the thing the theory promised, which is to be beyond the categories, and Dostoevsky's report on what that is actually like is the coldest passage in the book. Svidrigailov says that people always imagine eternity as something enormous, vast. And he says, what if it is just a small room, like a bathhouse in the country, sooty, with spiders in every corner, and that is the whole of eternity. And he says, I sometimes think that is how it will be. He is not being punished. That is the point. Nobody is punishing him. He has simply arrived at the end of the road. Raskolnikov is walking down, and what is at the end is not power and not damnation. It is a very small, dirty room with spiders in it, forever and boredom and no reason to do anything at all. And a few days later, he gives away all his money quite generously to people who need it, and walks out at dawn in front of a watchman and shoots himself in the head. That is the argument against the theory. Not hell, just what a person becomes when nothing is above him. And he was right about everything, and there is no one left to talk to. Which brings us to the man who catches him, because Porfiry Petrovich is the reason detective fiction has psychology in it. Porfiry has no evidence. He says so. He tells Raskolnikov to his face, more or less, that he cannot prove anything and does not intend to try, and that he is not going to arrest him. Instead, he does something much worse. He tells him he will confess on his own, and then he leaves him alone with that. His method is to make the suspect's own mind the instrument of the investigation. He talks in circles. He is friendly, he drops a fact, and then apologizes for dropping it. He tells him that a man who has done such a thing cannot run, because where would he run to? And that in any case running is not the danger, because the danger is that a man in his position needs air, and that Raskolnikov has stopped being able to breathe. He is doing therapy in bad faith. He is using the exact mechanism the whole book has been describing. The fact that the theory cannot be lived in, and he simply waits. And when Raskolnikov finally goes to the police station to confess, Porfiry is not even there. It is not a triumph. It is an administrative act. Now the ending, which is the part people argue about, and where I think most readings go soft, Raskolnikov is sentenced to 8 years in Siberia. Sonia, the prostitute who has been keeping her family alive and who earlier read him the raising of Lazarus out of a battered New Testament while he sat in the dark, follows him there and waits outside the prison. And for the first year and a half, nothing happens. He does not repent. He is not sorry. Dostoevsky is very direct about this, and readers skip past it. In prison, Raskolnikov still believes the theory. His conclusion is that he failed the test. Not that the test was rotten. He is ashamed of having been weak. That is all. He is also hated by the other convicts, as Dostoevsky was. And then, one morning, sitting by a river, watching the far bank where people are living the way people have lived for a very long time, something goes. Not an insight, not a proof. He simply finds himself on his knees at Sonia's feet, weeping. And the narrator says that they were both pale and thin, but that in those sick, pale faces there already shone the dawn of a renewed future. Dostoevsky then ends the novel almost immediately and says explicitly that the story of that renewal would be a new story and that this one is finished. He refuses to write the redemption, which is either a failure of nerve or the most honest sentence in the book, and I think it is the second one, because he had lived the Siberian version and he knew exactly how long the distance is between being broken open and being someone new, and he was not going to fake it in 20 pages. Part 7. The Good Man. In January 1868, Dostoevsky wrote to his niece Sofia Ivanova about the book he had just started, and he told her what he was attempting, and he told her he did not think he could do it. The main idea of the novel, he said, is to portray a positively beautiful man, and then there is nothing more difficult in the world, especially now. He goes through the precedents, and the list is revealing: Don Quixote, Mr. Pickwick, Jean Valjean. And he notes the problem with all of them, which is that they work by being ridiculous. Quixote is a joke. Pickwick is a joke. The reader is allowed to love them because the reader is also permitted to laugh at them, and the laughter is what makes the goodness bearable on the page. He wanted to do it without the joke. So the experiment of the idiot is this: take a man who is genuinely good, not naive, not stupid, not a saint in the devotional sense. Good. Incapable of contempt, incapable of calculation, incapable of using another person. Give him no armor of any kind. Then put him in a Russian drawing room where everybody wants money and status and each other, and see what happens. The answer, and this is why the book is so much stranger than its reputation, is that everybody dies. Prince Myshkin arrives in Petersburg on a train in the first chapter with almost nothing, coming back from 4 years in a Swiss sanatorium where he was treated for the epilepsy. He is 26. He is transparently embarrassingly honest, and everyone he meets notices it within a minute, and everyone reacts to it the same way, which is the observation the whole novel is built on. They are disarmed, and then they are frightened, and then they need him to be a fool. Because if he is a holy fool, an idiot, then his goodness is a symptom, and nobody has to account for the fact that a person can behave like that. And if he is not, then everybody in the room has to explain themselves. And the plot runs on two women. Nastasia Philippovna was taken in as an orphan at 12 by a rich landowner named Totsky, who raised her, and when she was 16, made her his mistress. He is now trying to marry her off with a dowry so he can make a respectable marriage himself. She is astonishingly beautiful. She is intelligent, and she is possessed by a rage about what was done to her that has curdled into something that looks like self-destruction and functions like it. And there is a scene about a fifth of the way in that is the single best thing Dostoevsky ever wrote about money. At her name day party, Rogozhin, a merchant's son who is obsessed with her, arrives with 100,000 rubles wrapped in newspaper to buy her. And Mishkin, who has just come into an inheritance, proposes marriage instead, out of pity and love, in front of everybody. And Nastasia takes the 100,000 rubles and throws the packet into the fireplace. And then she turns to Ganya, the ambitious clerk who has been planning to marry her for the dowry while despising her for her past, and tells him that if he reaches into the fire with his bare hands and pulls the money out, it is his, and that everyone will watch him do it. He faints. That is the whole book in one image. A woman who has been priced her entire life, setting the price on fire to see who will burn for it. Now the failure, which Dostoevsky wrote deliberately and which readers still resist, Mishkin cannot save her, and the reason he cannot is not that he is too weak or that the world is too cruel, it is that his goodness has a hole in it exactly where a decision should go. He loves Aglaya, who is young and alive and difficult, and who loves him back and who would have been a life. He pities Nastasia, whose ruin he can see completely and who he believes will be destroyed without him. And he will not choose. He cannot bring himself to inflict the loss on either one. So he oscillates sincerely, kindly, with total goodwill, and the oscillation destroys both of them, and it destroys Aglaya's family, and it drives Rogozhin past the point of endurance. Nastasia runs from her own wedding to Mishkin to Rogozhin, who takes her home and kills her with a knife. And the last scene of the novel is the two men, the murderer and the good man, lying beside the body in a darkened room through the night, and Mishkin stroking Rogozhin's hair while Rogozhin shakes, and by morning, Mishkin's mind has gone completely, not a relapse. He is taken back to Switzerland, to the same sanatorium, and he is not going to recover, and the doctor says so. The positively beautiful man ends the novel as the idiot everyone accused him of being, and everyone he loved is dead or wrecked, and Dostoevsky does not offer a single sentence suggesting his goodness accomplished something invisible. So what is the finding? Not that goodness is useless. Read the letter again. He was trying to portray it, not to prove it works. What the book demonstrates is that compassion without the capacity to refuse is not a completed virtue. Mishkin cannot say no. He cannot let someone be disappointed. He cannot accept that loving one person means failing another, and so he fails everyone gently, at length, with perfect sincerity. He is love in dreams, given a body and set loose 12 years before Zosima names the thing. One last piece, because it is the most quoted line from this novel and it is quoted wrong. Beauty will save the world. That is not Mishkin announcing his creed. It appears when Hippolyte, a 17-year-old dying of consumption who is furious about it, turns on the prince in front of company and asks him, half mocking, "Is it true, prince, that you once said the world will be saved by beauty?" It is thrown at him as an absurdity by a dying boy in a room where nobody takes it seriously, and Mishkin does not defend it. Dostoevsky was not in the business of handing you a slogan. He was in the business of putting one in the mouth of a character who is being laughed at, and letting you decide over the next 400 pages whether the laughter was correct. And in his last novel he gave the same idea to Dmitry Karamazov, who is drunk and desperate and much closer to the truth. And Dmitry says that beauty is not merely terrible, it is mysterious, that God and the devil are fighting there, and the battlefield is the heart of man. Part 8. The Possessed. In November 1869, a student at an agricultural academy outside Moscow, named Ivan Ivanov, told the small revolutionary cell he belonged to that he wanted out. He was not an informer, he simply disagreed with the leader and intended to leave. 4 days later, his fellow members of the cell lured him to a grotto on the academy grounds and strangled and shot him and weighted the body and put it under the ice of a pond, where it was found within a week because they were not very good at this. The leader's name was Sergei Nekhaev, and he was 22. And the reason he had the man killed is the reason Dostoevsky dropped everything and wrote a novel about it. Nekhaev did not kill Ivanov because Ivanov was dangerous. He killed him to bind the others, because a group that has committed a murder together cannot leave, cannot inform, and cannot go back to being students. Shared blood is the strongest organizational glue there is, and Nekhaev understood that at 22, and used it deliberately as a management technique. Dostoevsky followed the trial in the newspapers. His own brother-in-law was a student at that academy, and what he wrote out of it over the next 2 years was Demons, which is also translated as the possessed and sometimes as devils, and which is the least loved of his major novels, and the one that has aged into a documentary. The book takes its epigraph from the gospel story of the Gadarene swine. A man is possessed by a legion of demons. The demons are cast out into a herd of pigs. The herd runs down a steep bank into a lake and drowns. Dostoevsky's application is exact, and he spells it out. The demons are ideas, the pigs are us, and the sickness is not in the ideas, it is in the vessel. There are 2 men at the center of it, and they are the two halves of the thing. Pyotr Verkhovensky is the Nikhaev figure, and he is the funniest and most frightening character Dostoevsky ever wrote, because he does not believe in anything, not the revolution, not equality, not the future. He is not a fanatic who has gone too far. He is a man who has noticed that other people's convictions are a material you can build with, and who finds the whole business enjoyable. He recruits by flattery. He tells each member of the cell that he alone is trusted. He implies an enormous central committee that does not exist. He manages the group's ideological arguments the way a man manages livestock, and when the group has served its purpose, he engineers the murder that will weld it shut. And behind him is Nikolai Stavrogin, who is the opposite problem. Stavrogin is beautiful, aristocratic, physically fearless, and utterly empty. Everyone in the novel orbits him. Several characters have built entire belief systems out of things he said to them years ago and does not remember saying. One of them believes Stavrogin taught him that Russia is God-bearing. Another believes Stavrogin taught him atheism. Stavrogin said both to each of them in the same season because neither cost him anything. He is the underground man's freedom taken to its terminal state. Nothing is above him. Nothing constrains him. And because nothing constrains him, nothing means anything, and there is no act available to him that would feel different from any other act. And there is a chapter about what a man like that does with that condition, and Dostoevsky's publisher would not print it. The chapter is called At Tikhon's. In it, Stavrogin goes to a monk and hands over a written confession, and the confession describes his methodical abuse of a 12-year-old girl and what he did afterwards, which was to sit in the next room and wait, knowing what she was going to do, and let it happen. Mikhail Katkov, who was publishing the novel in installments, flatly refused it. So the greatest novel about political violence in the 19th century was published with its moral center cut out, exactly as Notes from Underground had been published with its moral center cut out 8 years earlier. Twice, the chapter that carried the weight was removed by a censor. The difference is that this one came back. The manuscript was found in Moscow in 1921, 40 years after Dostoevsky's death. It was translated into English by S.S. Koteliansky and Virginia Woolf and published by the Hogarth Press in 1922. Virginia Woolf translated Stavrogin's confession. That is a real sentence about the 20th century. Now, the reason people call this book prophetic, which is a word that gets thrown around too easily and in this case is close to earned, there is a theorist in the novel, a member of the cell called Shigalyov, who has worked out the future scientifically and presents it to the group. And his conclusion is that he started from the principle of unlimited freedom and arrived by rigorous steps at unlimited despotism. He is not embarrassed by this. He states it as a finding. His system divides humanity into a tenth who have absolute liberty and unlimited power over the remaining 9/10ths, who are reduced to a herd and, through generations of reprocessing, to a kind of innocence. And Verkovensky, who does not care about the theory, likes the numbers and adds his own contribution, which is a proposal about how many heads would have to come off to get there. He names a figure in the tens of millions and is untroubled by it. That was written in 1871 and 1872. The point is not that Dostoevsky predicted specific events, because he did not, and the people who claim he did are usually selling something. The point is narrower and more disturbing. He identified the mechanism. He saw that a movement organized around the total liberation of humanity can arrive at total control, not by being betrayed and not by being corrupted from outside, but by following its own logic honestly to the end. He saw that the people most useful to such a movement are not believers but operators, and that the believers are the raw material. And he saw that the binding agent is complicity, that once you have made people do something together that they cannot admit to, you own them, and you never have to threaten anyone again. He worked that out from a newspaper report about 5 students and a body in a pond, and he put it in a book that his contemporaries dismissed as a reactionary pamphlet, a hysterical overreaction to a minor crime by a handful of nobodies, an old man shouting at the young. They were reading it as a prediction and losing the argument on the facts, because in 1872 the facts were on their side. It was not a prediction, it was a diagnosis. And the difference is that a diagnosis does not need the disease to have progressed yet in order to be correct. Part 9. The Furnace of Doubt. There is a passage in the middle of the Brothers Karamazov that has a strange reputation. It is routinely described as the greatest argument against God ever written. What is stranger is who wrote it, and that he knew it was the greatest, and that he was pleased. In his notebooks, working on this section, Dostoevsky wrote this about it. Even in Europe there are not and have not been atheistic expressions of such force. Consequently, it is not as a boy that I believe in Christ and confess him, but my hosanna has passed through a great furnace of doubts. That is a believer bragging about the quality of the case against his own belief. And it should tell you immediately that the standard way this book gets discussed is wrong. Ivan Karamazov is not a straw man. He is not a clever atheist set up to be knocked over in the next chapter. He is Dostoevsky's own doubt, given the best lawyer in Russian literature and told to win. Here is how it is staged. 2 brothers meet in a tavern. Ivan is the intellectual, 23, an atheist. Alyosha is the youngest, a novice at the monastery. They have barely spoken in their lives, and they are about to go their separate ways. And Ivan says, essentially, before we part, I want to tell you what I actually think. And the first thing he does is take away the argument Alyosha was going to make. Ivan says he accepts God. He says it plainly. He is not going to argue about whether God exists. He says he accepts God and accepts God's wisdom and accepts that there may be some final harmony in which everything is reconciled and every tear is justified and the lion lies down with the lamb. And then he says, I do not accept the world that he made. He respectfully returns the ticket. Then he does the thing that makes the chapter unbearable, and it needs to be understood precisely. because it is a deliberate piece of intellectual engineering. Ivan restricts his evidence to children. He says so explicitly. Adults, he says, have eaten the apple. You can construct arguments about adult suffering. They knew, they chose, they are implicated. There is at least a story you can tell about desert and freedom and consequence. Children have not. A child of 5 has not consented to anything, cannot have deserved anything, and is not a participant in any cosmic bargain. And so Ivan produces his evidence, and it is real evidence. Dostoevsky took these accounts from Russian newspapers. He collected them. Ivan says in the text that he collects them. The parents who beat their 5-year-old daughter and lock her in a freezing outhouse all night for wetting the bed and smear her face with her own excrement, and the child sits there in the dark, hitting her chest with her tiny fist and praying to God to protect her. The general, a landowner with thousands of serfs and a kennel of hounds, whose 8-year-old serf boy throws a stone in play and hurts the paw of the general's favorite dog. The boy is taken away and held overnight. In the morning, the whole household is assembled to watch. The boy is stripped and told to run, and the general sets the pack on him and hunts him down in front of his mother. Ivan turns to Alyosha and asks the only question that matters. What should be done to that general? And Alyosha, the novice, the good one, the one who is going to spend the rest of the book being the moral center of it, says quietly, "Shoot him." That is Dostoevsky writing. He gives the saint the wrong answer because the right answer is not available, and then he lets Ivan say softly, "Well done, brother, so there is a little devil in you too." And then Ivan lands the actual argument, which is not about pain, it is about the price of the resolution. He says he does not want harmony. He says that if the final reconciliation requires that mother to embrace the man who hunted her son with dogs, and to forgive him, and for everyone to sing that God is just, then the harmony is not worth it. He would rather be left with his unavenged suffering and his indignation, even if he is wrong. Too high a price is asked for harmony, and so, he says, I hasten to return my ticket. Not, there is no God. Not, I refuse to believe. I have read the terms, and I decline to sign. That is the strongest form the problem of evil has ever been given, and it is strongest because it converts a metaphysical debate into a moral refusal, and a moral refusal cannot be answered by evidence. And Alyosha, who has been listening to all of it, says one thing back. He says, "This is rebellion." And then Ivan tells him a story he has been composing in his head, and the story is the Grand Inquisitor. Seville, the 16th century. The Inquisition is burning heretics daily, and Christ returns. Not at the end of time, just quietly, walking through the square. And people recognize him instantly and crowd around him, and he heals a blind man and raises a child. And the Grand Inquisitor, a cardinal, 90 years old, sees it all and points, and has him arrested. That night, the old man comes down to the cell, alone, and talks. Christ says nothing at all for the entire chapter. The Inquisitor's argument is this: you came to make men free. You could have taken away their freedom and given them bread and happiness, and you refused, because you wanted love that is freely given and not bought. And that was the mistake, because you overestimated them. You judged humanity by the handful who could bear it. He goes back to the 3 temptations in the wilderness and reads them as the 3 questions on which everything turns. Turn stones into bread, and you own them. You said man does not live by bread alone, but he does mostly, and the ones who are hungry will always lay their freedom at the feet of whoever feeds them, and they will do it gratefully. Throw yourself from the temple and be caught by angels, and you own them through miracle. You refused because you did not want faith compelled by spectacle. But there are 3 forces that can hold the conscience of these weak creatures forever, and they are miracle, mystery, and authority, and you rejected all 3. Take the kingdoms of the world, and you own them through unity. You refused that too. And so, the Inquisitor says, we took what you rejected, we took Rome and the sword of Caesar, and for 1,500 years we have been correcting your work. And then the sentence, the whole poem is built to deliver. We have corrected your work and founded it upon miracle, mystery, and authority. And men rejoiced that they were again led like sheep, and that the terrible gift which had brought them such suffering was at last lifted from their hearts. Understand who the Inquisitor is, because the usual reading is too easy. He is not a hypocrite. He is not in it for the power. He tells Christ that he too was once in the wilderness, that he too tried to be one of the strong, and that he came back and joined the ranks of those who have corrected the work out of love for humanity. He is running a lie knowingly and taking the damnation onto himself so that billions of ordinary people can have bread and certainty and a quiet death. He is the most sympathetic tyrant ever written, and Dostoevsky built him that way on purpose. Now here is the contradiction at the center of Dostoevsky's entire body of work, and he never resolves it, and I do not think he could have. The underground man says that a human being will destroy his own happiness rather than surrender his freedom. That freedom is the most advantageous advantage, the thing nobody will trade. The Grand Inquisitor says that a human being will hand over his freedom the moment somebody offers him bread and certainty, and will thank him for it. Both of those are in Dostoevsky. Both are argued at full strength. Neither is retracted. And that is not sloppiness. That is what Bakhtin meant when he said these novels are polyphonic, that they contain a plurality of independent and unmerged voices, and that the author never takes the last word. Dostoevsky is not a man with a thesis who dramatizes it. He is a man who builds the strongest possible version of each position, puts them in the same building, and refuses to arbitrate. Which is also why the poem does not end with a rebuttal. Christ, who has not spoken for the entire chapter, stands up and crosses the room and kisses the old man on his bloodless 90-year-old lips. That is the answer. That is the whole answer. The Inquisitor shudders. Something moves at the corner of his mouth. He goes to the door, opens it, and says, "Go and do not come again, never." And he lets him out into the dark streets of the city, And Ivan adds the line that makes it devastating. The kiss glows in his heart, but the old man adheres to his idea. He is not converted. He was right about everything he said, and the kiss did not refute a word of it, and it also did not leave him unchanged, and he goes on with the burnings anyway. Then the poem ends, and we are back in the tavern with two brothers and a bill to pay, and Alyosha, who has no counter-argument and knows it, gets up and leans over and kisses Ivan on the lips. And Ivan laughs and says, "That's plagiarism. You stole that from my poem. Thank you, though." Now, the last thing, and it is the most quoted sentence in Dostoevsky, and he did not write it. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. It is not in the book. Ivan never says it. Nobody says it in those words. It is a compression that hardened into a quotation, and it was Sartre above all who put it into that shape and treated it as the doorway to existentialism. What is actually in the novel is worse for Ivan, and much better as psychology. Ivan's idea does not stay in Ivan's head. It gets into the house, and the person who picks it up is Smerdyakov, the epileptic servant, the fourth brother nobody acknowledges, a cringing, resentful, extremely intelligent man whom Ivan has spent the whole novel treating as beneath conversation. And Smerdyakov listens, and Smerdyakov murders their father. And then he explains to Ivan calmly in the last of 3 interviews that he did it on Ivan's instructions, which Ivan never gave, and by Ivan's reasoning, which Ivan certainly did give, and that Ivan knew and left town anyway, which was permission. "You are the murderer," he tells him. "I was only your instrument." That is the actual judgment the novel passes on the idea. Not that it is false, that you do not get to hold it privately. That an idea in a man's head is a live thing that walks downstairs and finds the weakest person in the house and does something with its hands. And Ivan, who has spent 700 pages being the most powerful mind in the book, goes back to his room and finds a shabby, sponging, unbearably chatty gentleman sitting on his sofa, who may be the devil and may be a fever, and who knows every one of his arguments because he is made of them, and who will not stop talking. The double is back. 34 years after Goliadkin, and this time Dostoevsky knows exactly what it is, and so does the reader, and it destroys him. Part 10. Active love. So Dostoevsky has built the strongest case against God in the history of the novel, and he has put it in the mouth of a character he refuses to humiliate, and now he has to answer it. He knew the size of the problem. He wrote to his editor, Nikolai Lyubimov, at the Russian Herald, about what he was attempting next, and the sentence is unusually exposed for him. "If I succeed," he wrote, "I will accomplish something good. I will make people acknowledge that a pure, ideal Christian is not an abstract matter, but rather something figuratively real, possible, visibly present. Look at what he has committed himself to there. Not a counter-argument, not a proof, a demonstration. He is going to answer a philosophical case by producing a person, And the reply to Book 5, which is the Grand Inquisitor, is Book 6, which is the life of a dying monk. Almost every critic since has said that Book 6 is weaker than Book 5. They are right, in the sense they mean it. As argument, it does not land the way the rebellion lands. Ivan is thrilling and Zosima is quiet, and you do not walk away from Zosima with a line you want to repeat at a dinner party. But I think the imbalance is the point, and I think Dostoevsky knew exactly what he was doing, because he tells you the answer will not be an argument in the plainest scene in the entire book, hundreds of pages earlier. A woman comes to see Zosima, Madame Khokhlakova. She is wealthy, she is well-meaning, she is enormously talkative, and she has a problem she wants solved. She has lost her faith, and she wants proof of the immortality of the soul, and she says she is tormented by it. And she tells him about her dream of what she could be. She says she sometimes thinks about giving everything up and becoming a sister of mercy, tending wounds, washing the sick. And Zosima asks her what stops her. And she is honest, which is the reason the scene works. She says, I could bear it, except that the patient would be ungrateful. She says she could do the work if the man whose soul she washed thanked her for it. She says that if he complained, or was rude, or did not notice, she could not go on. And Zosima does not scold her. He tells her about a doctor he once knew who said that he loved humanity, but that the more he loved humanity in general, the less he loved people in particular. That in his dreams he was ready to crucify himself for mankind, and that in real life he could not stay in the same room with a man for 2 days, because the man would chew too loudly or say something stupid, and it would ruin everything. And then Zosima gives her the answer to her question about immortality, and it has nothing to do with immortality. He tells her that if she loves her neighbor actively and tirelessly, then in proportion as her love grows, she will become sure of God and of the immortality of her soul. He says nobody has ever proved it another way. And then he says the sentence that is, I think, the load-bearing sentence of Dostoevsky's entire mature work. I am sorry that I cannot say anything more comforting, for active love is a harsh and fearful thing compared with love in dreams. He explains it, and the explanation is merciless. Love in dreams, he says, thirsts for immediate action, quickly performed, and with everyone watching. It will go as far as giving your life, provided it does not take too long and is soon over, as though on stage, with everybody looking on and praising you. Whereas active love is labor and perseverance, and for some people, perhaps, a whole science. Sit with what that does to Ivan. Ivan's rebellion is structurally love in dreams. It is enormous, it is total, it is about all the children in the world, and it commits him to precisely nothing on Tuesday. He returns the ticket to the universe, and he does not visit his father, and he does not speak kindly to Smerdyakov, and when the moment comes he gets on a train. That is Dostoevsky's answer, and it is not that Ivan is wrong. It is that Ivan's position, however unanswerable, does not survive contact with a specific person who needs something specific done, and that the whole category of universal moral feeling is a way of loving everybody so that you do not have to love anybody by name. And the counterpart to it, the other half of Zosima's teaching, is the sentence that everyone finds intolerable. Each of us is guilty before everyone, for everyone and everything. Not responsible, guilty. Now that sounds like religious excess until you look at what it is doing. It is the exact inverse of the underground. The underground man's freedom is negative. It is the freedom to refuse, to spite, to withhold, to answer 5 when the answer is 4. It buys him sovereignty, and it costs him every other person, and he ends in a room alone. Zosima's guilt is a claim of total connection. If I am guilty for everyone, then nothing anyone does is outside my jurisdiction, which means I am never a spectator, which means I am never alone. It is the most expensive possible answer to isolation, and it is the only one Dostoevsky ever offers. And crucially, it is not a feeling you are supposed to have. It is a practice. It is what you do on the days you do not feel it, which is what the word active is doing in the phrase active love. Now, the reason I trust this book, and the reason it is not propaganda, is what Dostoevsky does immediately afterwards. Zosima dies, and the monastery expects a miracle, because that is what happens when a holy elder dies. The body is supposed to remain incorrupt. People have come from all over the district. Alyosha is certain of it. And instead the body begins to stink. Fast. Faster than normal. By the afternoon, the smell has filled the cell, and it is spreading down the corridor. And the monks who resented Zosima's fame are barely hiding their satisfaction, and they are saying out loud that God has passed judgment, and the pilgrims are scandalized, and the whole thing becomes a small, ugly public humiliation of a dead good man. Dostoevsky is a devout Orthodox Christian writing the argument for faith, and he gives his saint a rotting corpse and a jeering audience. He does not permit himself the miracle. The one moment where a lesser writer would have cashed the check, he tears it up, because a demonstration that requires the laws of decomposition to be suspended is not a demonstration of anything a person could use. And Alyosha, who has just watched his teacher be posthumously mocked, walks out and has the crisis of the novel, and it is Ivan's argument arriving in his body rather than his head. And what brings him back is not an explanation either. He falls asleep listening to a monk read the wedding at Cana, dreams that Zosima is at the feast, and that the feast is joy, wakes, goes outside, and throws himself down on the earth and kisses it, weeping, and gets up, in Dostoevsky's phrase, a firm fighter. 3 days later, he leaves the monastery for good on Zosima's instruction, because the point was never to stay in there. And then, at the very end, 800 pages on, Dostoevsky closes the circle he opened in Siberia 30 years earlier, and I do not think he did it by accident. A boy in the town has died. Ilyusha, 9 years old, humiliated in front of his school friends because his father was publicly dragged by the beard by Dmitry Karamazov, and who fought the whole school over it, and who then got sick and died. And after the funeral, a group of schoolboys gathers at a stone, and Alyosha, who is 23, makes them a speech. And this is what he tells them: that there is nothing higher or stronger or more wholesome or more useful for life in the future than some good memory, especially a memory from childhood, from home. The people talk a lot about education, but a memory like that, preserved from childhood, may be the best education of all. That if a man carries many such memories into life, he is safe to the end of his days. And that if he has only one good memory left in his heart, even that may sometime be the means of saving him. Now go back to a prison barracks in Omsk on an Easter afternoon in 1850. A man is lying on a bunk with his eyes closed, in a room full of violence, having just been told by an educated European that these people are animals, and he agrees, and then a memory arrives, unbidden, of a serf in a field who put a hand on a frightened boy's cheek and told him there was no wolf. One good memory from childhood, from home, and it was the means of saving him. He put his own rescue in the mouth of a 23-year-old at a child's funeral, in the last thing he ever finished, and he did not explain the connection, and as far as I can tell, he never once pointed it out. Part 11. The Waking. Before the last scene, the part that most videos about this man leave out and should not. Dostoevsky held opinions that are indefensible. He was, in his last decade, a Russian nationalist of an increasingly strident kind. He believed Russia had a redemptive mission the rest of Europe lacked. He wrote things about Catholics, about Poles, and above all about Jews in his journalism that are ugly, that were ugly at the time, that his own contemporaries objected to in print, and that no amount of context makes better. None of that is cancelled by the novels, and the novels are not cancelled by it. Both things are on the record. A man capable of writing the most generous account of human interiority ever attempted was also capable of ordinary period bigotry. And if that seems like a contradiction, it is worth remembering that the whole of his work is about people who contain contradictions of exactly that size and do not resolve them. He would not have been surprised. He would have said it was the point. Now, the last scene. On the 8th of June, 1880, by the old Russian calendar, a monument to Pushkin was unveiled in Moscow. It was a national event. Every significant writer in Russia was there, including Turgenev, who represented everything Dostoevsky had spent 20 years arguing against, and with whom he had a long and personal history of dislike. Dostoevsky was 58, and he was not well. He had emphysema. He had another 8 months to live, and there is reason to think he knew the shape of it. He gave a speech about Pushkin, and the speech is not really about Pushkin. Its central claim about the poet is that his particular genius was a capacity for universal sympathy, that Pushkin could become other nations, could write a Spaniard or an Englishman or an Arab from the inside without condescension, and that this was not a trick of technique but a moral capacity, and that it was the deepest thing in the Russian character. You can hear the nationalism in that, and it is there, and it gets louder in the second half of the speech, and some of what he says about Russia's role in Europe is the same material that makes his journalism hard to read. But the passage that made the room come apart was about a woman in a poem. Tatiana, in Eugene Onegin, loves Onegin. She wrote to him when she was young and he turned her down, politely and a little cruelly. Years later, she is married to an old general, she has a position, she is admired, and Onegin comes back and finds that he loves her now and tells her so. And she tells him that she loves him too. She says it directly, and then she refuses him and stays with her husband. And Dostoevsky stands in front of the most important audience of his life and asks why. Not because she is dutiful, not because she is afraid. He says it is because she cannot build her happiness on another person's unhappiness, that there are souls which will not hand over what is sacred to them to dishonor, even out of infinite compassion, and that Tatiana is one, and that this is the highest thing in the poem and the highest thing in Russia. Now put that next to Ivan Karamazov, which Dostoevsky had finished writing months earlier. Ivan returns his ticket because he will not accept a harmony purchased with the suffering of one tortured child. He refuses to be happy on those terms. Tatiana refuses to be happy on those terms. It is the same sentence, said twice from opposite directions. Ivan uses it to reject the world, Tatiana uses it to stay in her life. And the man who wrote them both was, in his last public act, standing in a hall in Moscow arguing that the second one is what the first one is for. The reaction is one of the strangest events in the history of literature. People wept openly, women fainted, men shouted, strangers embraced each other in the aisles. Someone in the audience is reported to have called out that he was a saint or a prophet. The applause would not stop and did not stop, and eventually the police had to be brought in to manage the crowd around the building. Accounts of what Turgenev did differ, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, because the story got polished immediately by everyone who was there, and the more moving versions are the least reliable ones. What is not in dispute is the scale of the thing. For one afternoon, a novelist stood in a public square in Moscow, and the country lost its composure. 7 months later, on the 28th of January, 1881, he had a pulmonary hemorrhage and died at home. He was 59. The Brothers Karamazov had been finished for 2 months. In the preface, he had told the reader that Alyosha's real story was the second novel, and that the one you were holding was only the preparation for it. There is no second novel. That is what he was going to do next. Tens of thousands of people followed the coffin. It was reported as one of the largest funerals Petersburg had seen. Students walked in front, carrying the chains he had worn in Siberia. Now, the inheritance, which is the reason we are still doing this. 6 years after he died, Nietzsche found him in a bookshop in Nice and rebuilt part of his own psychology around him. 47 years after he died, Freud wrote an essay about him that got the medicine wrong and the reading method wrong and is still in print. Einstein said he took more from him than from almost any thinker. Kafka called him one of his blood relatives. Camus put him at the center of the rebel and adapted the possessed for the stage. Ralph Ellison built Invisible Man out of the underground. Every unreliable narrator you have ever read, every novel that puts you inside a mind you cannot trust and does not tell you when to stop trusting it, is downstream of a novella that was published in 1864 with the answer censored out of it. And the reason is not that he was a good prose stylist. He was not particularly, and Nabokov built a whole lecture out of saying so. It is that he found the mechanism he worked out, before there was a discipline to work it out in, that a person is not one thing with one set of wants, that there is a part of you that is on your side and a part that is not, and that the second part is not a defect or a demon, but the price of being able to choose at all, that this part will burn down a good life to prove the life was yours, that it can be bought off for a while by comfort and by ideology, and by bread and certainty from anyone who offers to carry the freedom for you, and that the only thing that has ever reliably reached it is not an argument. Coda. We started on a parade ground in the snow, with a 28-year-old man who had less than a minute to live, and who got the minute back, and who wrote to his brother that same day that life is a gift, life is happiness. Each minute might have been an age of it. And then spent 31 years writing about people who set that gift on fire. Here is what I think he found out, and I want to put it as plainly as he would have refused to. He found that the part of you that ruins things is not a stranger. It is not weakness, and it is not damage, and it is not something you can be argued out of, because it is made of the same material as your capacity to choose anything at all. It is what freedom looks like when it has nothing worth spending itself on. It would rather own a catastrophe than rent a decent life. He found that no arrangement of the world reaches it. Not a better society, not a fairer one, not the Crystal Palace with its gardens under glass. You can remove every external cause of human misery, and the thing will still be sitting there in a comfortable room looking for something to break, because being comfortable was never what it wanted. He found that it can be bought off temporarily, and that this is the real danger, and that the price is always the same. Bread and certainty, somebody to tell you what is true, and to carry the weight of deciding. The Inquisitor is not wrong that most people will take that trade. He is only wrong that they should. And he found, against his own best argument, and after 4 years in leg irons and a dead 3-year-old son and a lifetime of seizures, that the thing does occasionally get reached, not by proof, not by a better philosophy, by a specific person doing a specific thing on a specific day, usually badly, usually without knowing it mattered. A serf stopping his plough in a field, a woman who keeps sending the money, a kiss at the end of an argument you have already lost. That is not a solution, and he never called it one. He called it harsh and fearful, and he meant it, because active love is labor and perseverance, and love in dreams is what we do instead, and the difference between them is the whole distance between the man Ivan is and the man Alyosha is. So if you take one thing out of the last 2.5 hours, do not take the underground. Everyone takes the underground. It is the most flattering room in literature, and it will keep you there for years, feeling perceptive. Take the other thing. Take the fact that the man who built that room, who furnished it better than anyone before or since, who could have lived in it, walked out. Not because someone won an argument with him, because he remembered a hand on his face. You have one of those too. Almost everyone does. He said through a 23-year-old at a child's funeral in the last thing he ever finished, that if you have only one good memory left in your heart, even that may sometime be the means of saving you. He was not being sentimental. He was reporting. Next time, we are going to stay with the man who found Dostoevsky by accident in a bookshop in Nice and said his heart rejoiced, and go all the way into what Friedrich Nietzsche did with what he found there. Some lessons do not help you sleep. They wake you up.